All right. I feel we could do better with the music. Have you figured out a way, Brad, to bring like other music into this?
We'll
into
talk.
this tool?
Yeah. There's a look. I'll get you set up on the music. We'll talk about that.
Thanks, appreciate it. Well, I'm very excited about today. Welcome everyone. Me and Brad were chatting last week on LinkedIn about what makes a protocol good or bad. It was kind of triggered by a post on where Brad said, all the technology in the world and site access network and all the amazing things we're trying won't solve for a shitty protocol, which made me think, well, what is that, right? What makes for a shitty protocol? So I asked the question. Well, anyway, Brad, what did you do from there?
So, I mean, first of all, it is a fair and good question, because I did read the comments, like when you posed the question, and it's kind of interesting, the different responses. And I got the feeling that you weren't satisfied necessarily by any of the sort of more subjective responses. So I started typing out like this whole long thing and like examples that I wanted to sort of like talk about. I think I was traveling at the time, and I was like, this sucks. I'm just going to see, maybe he'll want to talk about it live. And, I know there's, a few people out there listening. I would also, love to hear comments from the crowd. I think, interestingly, we all have really different perspectives and different touch points with protocols. So it's a perfectly fair question. Like what constitutes a bad protocol, or, opposite, like what makes a good protocol?
Yeah, exactly. I think, I would love for the audience to contribute, because I think we can look at this problem from 10 different directions. I think the answer on sort of the subjective way to look at a protocol is good. I think it's like a good sort of litmus test or something for a protocol. But what I think is super important that we get right in our industry is it's easy to see what's broken, but then how do we think about solutions, and like how do we get to a point where it's specific enough that it's actionable, right? So I imagine the ideal outcome of this is that study teams at some point, see this recording, or watch this live, or the people who are designing the protocols, and think, what, actually I picked up on this one thing about like the number of recurring visits, or participant burden, or the way the protocol is set up, and maybe we should talk about this, right? I mean, that's also what you mentioned. The whole point of like raising these issues is to get people talking and to get people thinking. But I think if we can get to some more concrete examples, it makes it much easier for everyone to actually focus on a specific element of a protocol that can be improved, because there's so many places where you can look for improvement. But maybe to start off, like maybe with that litmus test, like is there like I can give you my perspective when I get a protocol as a vendor, but when you receive a protocol from a sponsor, like the initial, there's some kind of intuition, pattern recognition probably happening in your brain. Like, what does that look like? Like the initial thoughts and feeling.
Yeah, and it's a good question, and it's something like we've been independently discussing internally like for a little while now, because it's tough, and I think we oftentimes probably choose wrong more than we choose right. And I've seen instances in which I'm like, man, this protocol is going to be tough, and then we go out there and we actually destroy it. Or we have protocols that are like, this looks like it's going to be great, and it ends up being a dog, and we can't enroll a single patient. So a lot of people kind of talked about the gut check, or the sort of just subjective, let's discuss this, let's look at it. I mean, obviously, and for me, if you go back, I've often been asked, like, what do you think is the biggest single problem, like in clinical trials? And I think this dovetails nicely into this conversation. And I think it's inclusion exclusion criteria. For me, it's that so often, like I'm frustrated every day that we work with a busy IBD clinic. We have 12 IBD studies, and I can't get a goddamn patient into an IBD trial because none of them meet the criteria. And to me, that like blows my mind. It's almost just by the virtue of you having received care appropriately according to standard of care, you're automatically not going to fit into a trial. So it's the patient population we're testing a drug on is not reflective of the real world population. And to me, that blows my mind. And I'm guessing there must be like some great scientific validity as to why that's the case. Otherwise, I don't know why we're doing this to ourselves over and over again. But that's probably my single biggest complaint, is that, frankly, the people who need it the most are not the people who qualify for the trial. And so oftentimes you end up with, unfortunately, people who are desperate for something because they don't have medical care. They're the ones who qualify because they're naive, to all the different medications that would otherwise disqualify them. They don't have a bunch of comorbidities that have been recorded because they don't go to the doctor, which to me is also a big problem in and of itself if you stand back and sort of look at the patient population you end up with. So that, to me, if I had to like make a case of one big thing that's like a huge problem, that's it for me.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because clearly, I mean, why the IE so narrow? Presumably because whoever made the protocol assumed that in that subgroup, this intervention is going to be more effective than standard of care, right? I mean, that's of course that's the kind of data they want. And if we already know that standard of care isn't going to be dramatically worse, then why would we spend all this money on enrolling these patients? But at the same time, look, that is the reality, and ultimately, the real-world evidence will answer that question anyway, right? So, I think maybe what's happening.
That's after a drug is approved, right?
Exactly.
Like,
yeah.
So, but isn't that sort of like backwards? Like, shouldn't we already know if it's safe and effective, more safe and more effective than what's already on the market, like before we unleash it on millions of people? Like, doesn't that seem a little bit insane to you?
I mean, evidence-based medicine is just, a whole beast that is broken in many different ways. But, ultimately the approval pathway, the trials you're running are going to be about safety and efficacy, not necessarily about superiority to another treatment. Very, like, how often do you see a phase 3 trial that goes head to head to the standard of care, right? It's always placebo-controlled trial.
Yeah, and that's it. Yeah, and that's another interesting aspect is, again, so you're giving patients almost no good reason to be in a trial. But that kind of comes back to the concept of clinical trials as a care option, which we can debate probably over a series of other live streams. But
for sure,
yeah,
I think the point here is, like, look, there's a reason to make the IEs narrow, but does it weigh against the fact that it's almost impossible to enroll? Probably not, because you invested all this money already to get this trial off the ground. There's some money at least flowing. I don't actually know if you get paid for a site initiation visit, but presumably, not enrolling, it doesn't mean zero. So money is being invested in this trial anyway. And now, you can come back to that. But we're investing money anyway. So, like, let's just enroll patients, and then we can maybe look at a subgroup later. But I think so. I think that's great feedback, right? Because ultimately, what is a trial worth that doesn't enroll at all? That's really literally worth nothing. And so,
and again, it happens so much more often than I would like. And I think and maybe to your point, like, maybe that's just what it is. By scientific necessity, these trials need to be incredibly narrow. And if that's the case, then I think we just need to accept the fact that this is going to take a really long time. It's going to cost a whole lot of money. Obviously, there are improvements we can make. But if that's the case, then, maybe that's just it. We need to accept the fact that this is going to be a long, slow trudge of a process. The unfortunate part is that, it puts sites in a bind in many instances, and you're not sites aren't able to stay open and viable when you can't put patients in trials.
I agree. But so you mentioned scientific, right? It's also, I think, economic. The thing is, it's just expensive to run a trial, and a bigger trial is more expensive than a little trial. So, like, what is the smallest trial we can run to get ROI? And unfortunately, again, this comes back to, I'm not sure if you saw that graph on like how many drugs we're actually getting to market for each dollar spent on R&D, but it's just a very linear decline, basically. And so, the low hanging fruit has basically been picked. So now we need to be very mindful of like how much can we spend on an additional like subgroup, and then this becomes an economic ROI debate. Like if you make that a huge 10,000 person, 3,000 person trial that you open up to everyone, that might not yield the answer you wanna see, then you can't run the trial. So it's scientific, but it's also, I think, very much economic. Bigger trials are just way more expensive, specifically phase 3 trials. Like they're just incredibly expensive, and so I think that all goes into, and this is the reality of life science. There's all these competing factors. However, I think we can agree on a trial that doesn't enroll isn't good to anyone, right? So that's, I think, a basic basic point that we can get behind.
I mean, and I don't know if there's anything it's different, maybe a different topic, but like, are we looking for such small improvements at this point that we need to stay that narrow? Like, I don't know. Again, I'm not a scientist, so like some of these, I would love to hear from like the people who write these protocols. Show yourselves if you're out there.
Yeah, for sure.
To know, just like, because I also think that would inform and help sites too, like just to understand, like, okay, this is exactly why like we chose this particular criteria. We just did a trial where, it's a migraine trial. Anyone over 30 BMI was excluded, which I live in Oklahoma. That's a shitload of people, man. That's a lot of people. So we had to exclude so many people that otherwise qualified. And once the drug was approved, do you think that they didn't prescribe it to people with a BMI over 30? No, they did.
Oh yeah.
So I mean, does not also seem bizarre? Like we don't even know. We don't know if it's effective or not. But now we're going to go ahead and give it to them. Is that good? That doesn't seem like good science to me.
I hope there was some kind of phase 4 trial that got spun up, where it was more like real world evidence is a big thing, right? But do you run many of those trials, or are you almost always in like the thick of it with the registration trials, basically?
Yeah, we have a little bit of phase 4, I guess, so sort of post market, but I don't know, I feel like we haven't seen as much lately. And then you get into like, again, those are oftentimes a lot of data collection for not much, not much compensation on the site side. So a lot of sites, I think, like to pass up on those unless you can just do an insane amount of volume.
Well, there's so many interesting sub threads we could kind of jump on here, right? Because real world evidence is the answer to all those questions you're asking, right? So, of course, at some point you got to pick something and roll with it to get through registration, and then you can use your phase 4 trials to expand the label and to target different subpopulations. Or like at least study efficacy in, for example, pregnant women or something like that, But then immediately the budgets go down because now we got the thing to the market, and we need to use that money to develop new drugs to get them to the market, which is also an interesting sort of competition that's going on within these, within the sponsors. But the real world evidence is super important, and it's kind of it's interesting to hear that for the sites it's also not that interesting because there's less money there. So we finally get to a point where we can start to answer these questions, and then everyone's like, well, let's just do another new one.
Right. That's fair.
So,
and again, I think that's just one component of like, I think what, at least I feel like what I mean when I say this is a bad protocol or these are bad protocols is that they're impossible to enroll in a pool of patients that should be representative of who the drug is going to be prescribed to.
Yeah, I agree. And so what does good look like then? Can you give me an example of specifically on the IE side where you're like, yes, this makes sense. Like we can do this.
I mean, I hate to say that I like struggle to think of like a great one, but like there are protocols that are, again, I think broadly just more representative of the patient population, or, drugs, studies where potentially there truly isn't a great standard of care. So you've got a little bit more of a fresh slate, I guess, to work with patients that are a little more naive in general. I will also say device trials tend to run a lot more smoothly and enroll at a higher clip. And I think that's, I don't know, again, go into the reasons for that, but I think for whatever reason, they tend to work out so much more easily.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Device trials are different. I do think that they're, the whole approval pathway is different. So the trials, by definition, are also going to be different.
Well, and this is another aspect of, to sort of go beyond, but like, we talk about bad protocols, a lot of that has to do with the support, not just the protocol itself, but I think sometimes the support around a protocol. And I feel like with the device trials, there are like reps on site almost all the time, like maybe not in your research clinic, but they are on site, maybe in the cath lab. So those relationships seem to be stronger, and they tend to be a little bit more hands-on, which can be bad, but I think in many ways helps support the site and help them enroll patients more easily as well. So again, just another aspect, not to sort of like start derailing, but people say bad protocols. I think sometimes what they also mean is not good support for that protocol. I think device trials have that sort of like in the bag. Like they're good at that.
Yeah. So what would that look like for a drug trial then? Do you want a pharma rep or
so we've seen, I've worked on studies where there are, so it's a hard line to walk, right? Because it's already like, hey man, I already got like 5 people from the sponsor bothering me, maybe at any given time. So like to put another person in there, it can be hard to swallow. But I've seen studies that have these like clinical trial liaison roles where they're not a monitor. They're not, they're almost just like an account rep that's like, how can we help you? What's going right? What's going wrong? Here are some things that other sites have done. I think that's a huge underutilized sort of role that, and I don't know, maybe there's a reason why we don't see it a lot, but I think that's cool. And they also help look at sites a little more holistically versus like, let's look for this one type of patient and that's it.
Right.
So
again,
there's
like a site success manager. Like we have CSMs.
Okay, yeah,
that's cool. It's very intriguing. I feel like for a lot of these things, it seems like if you see as a line in the budget, it looks expensive. But I think there's so many things that have just such incredible ROI. It's just hard to make it tangible, right? Which I think is why it's important that we have these conversations, because maybe it's a complete no-brainer to at any site where you expect, let's say, over 10% of your study enrollment, to have a dedicated person to help them be successful. Like, it sounds like a really sensible thing, but apparently it's not that common. At the same time, you probably don't want. I mean, how many trials do you run at any given time?
I mean, I think we have about 50 active right now, and our pipeline's probably close to that big. So yeah, it's.
So you clearly don't want 50 people hanging around your site.
Yeah, right? I was going to say that's it. It in fairness, it's sort of it's a fine line between more help versus just more people or more relationships to manage. That can be hard.
But do you have a hotline at least or something like that? Like, can it be centralized? Like, when you struggle with the protocol, you're like, how the hell are other sites doing this? Like, can you call someone, or what does that look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, again, it's something that's fairly underutilized because there's really no, community around each individual study. And again, I've seen it. I saw in a recent device trial where they were like, hey, the rep was like, hey, talk to the site in Atlanta. They figured out a process for this. You call them up. Or, hey, you guys do this really well. Is it okay if the coordinator from Arkansas calls you? And like, well, hell yeah, of course. I would love to share like what's working great for us. And, that's tough to do if you're a coordinator who's busting your ass all day and taking phone calls and getting PI signatures and dealing with CRAs to actively or proactively do that. But even if it's just a intro, like from a sponsor or a CRO contact, that goes a super long way. So again, something that I feel like isn't that costly, but is still severely underutilized.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think it makes total sense to at least have a call center for each protocol that you have active out there to just share best practices from where things are going well.
You might get a newsletter made in you know, whatever that Microsoft publisher or whatever, like once every quarter with some tips in it. But so that's about the extent of what you get for most trials.
Yeah. Okay. And so, all right. So we spoke about inclusion exclusion criteria. We spoke about just site support and just device trials being easier and actually sometimes be nice to have a rep even on site, but would at least be nice to have some knowledge sharing that's coordinated, on the sponsor side. And so, when I look at a protocol, we often very quickly just scroll to the schedule of events because that's, it's critical for us. Like for us, the inclusion, like obviously we want our sponsors to be successful, but it's kind of hard for us to judge what these IEs will mean. Of course, we can speak to a partner who has all this information on how these trials enroll, all these fancy machine learning models, but in the end, we just want to make sure, like, can we deliver our part successfully? So
sure,
scroll down to the schedule of events, right? What are they expecting on the site side? What are they expecting on the patient side? Like how hybrid or not is this study? And then sometimes I see a protocol and I see, the oncology study, all these cycles, but then they kind of describe how the cycle repeats itself, but it's not like in a predictable way. So it's like this cycle repeats 3 times, this one repeats 4 times, and I was like, I need to like put this in an AI so it can actually extrapolate from what they say, so I can actually see the real schedule, not kind of the schedule that you should extrapolate from. I think like that seems like an easy win to at least make it easy to understand what we're trying to achieve in a trial at the very least. And then sometimes, of course, there's just so much on there. You think, oh, you're going to put the participant or the site through all this. So how do you look at that? Like, what do you look for when you look at the schedule of events?
Yeah. So, and that's sort of my second bullet point. It's notes I've been taking, but one of them is that, like, to your point, I think there's no workflow in any way when it comes to a protocol, which is, debatably that's fine. But if you pick up a very complex protocol, it's not enough to tell you how to actually do the trial. And I think that's oftentimes the only thing you have to make a decision as a site. They come on, they'll do some site selection visit slides. You've got a protocol or synopsis. That's all you've got. And it's not complete enough. And even if it is, to your point, it can be extremely confusing. And again, no, fault of the great CRAs who come out, but so many times they're being shipped around to fill in, to do a site selection. They've never been a part of the study. They don't know anything about the study. They're just reading a slide deck to you. So you pick up a protocol, and you can look at a schedule of assessments, but you could also look at the page and a half of footnotes that reference completely different sections of the protocol. And you just can't, I think, get a good picture of the simplicity or complexity by looking at the protocol alone. And if you can, it's going to take you quite some time to really suss that out. So I think that's another big problem, is that they're just written in a way that does not account for, like, what you do when and how, even though that should be the definition of what a protocol is. But instead you got to go to a lab manual, something that's hidden in an SIV slide somewhere. Any other number of training portals that you have to go through. It's not enough. The protocol is not enough.
So can you give us an example of when you said no to a protocol? Like how often? What is the dynamic these days? Like, is there more supply or demand of sites? Like, what is it like? Are you in a position to say, I don't want that, or do you just take what you can get? What's the dynamic?
So I think it probably depends on a lot. So there's a lot of studies out there right now. It probably depends on, we work across just about every therapeutic area, which gives us maybe a bigger bucket to pull from. We're also becoming more established over time, so we can afford to, like, not reach too far. So if you're a small community site, you may take every study opportunity that comes your way because you feel, you know when the next study opportunity is going to come, so you're going to take it. I do think, as you grow as a site, it becomes more important to be, more discerning and not take those trials on. So we have been turning trials away a lot more frequently, especially when we feel like, they're just not enrollable. Again, unless there's a super special interest from the PI, it's another layer of those. There's politics at sites. There may be other reasons why the they speak for this sponsor and they want to be a KOL, so they're going to take on a protocol even though it's not really going to work out for them, and the coordinators are going to get stuck with the work. So very long-winded answer, I apologize, but I think frankly it's important for sites to turn away protocols that are either objectively bad or just don't fit for them. But I feel like the pressure is generally on for a site to take a study. And I'll say this because it's important. I don't know if people know this. You do a site selection visit, give them all your info. A month and a half passes. You get an email that says, congratulations, here's your study. Here's your regulatory packet. Here's your budget. Well, you didn't ask me if I even wanted it. It's almost just like you're expected to like start on the regulatory. So here's the ICF. Can you start mocking it up now, please? And so it puts you in a funny position as a site because you also don't want to, I don't want to piss off the biggest drug companies in the world by being like, psych, I don't want your study. We went through site selection and we actually realized it doesn't fit well for us. So it's not a two-way communication,
So site selection is for the sponsor to decide if you are a fit, but not necessarily for the site to decide if they're a fit.
Ideally, and look, again, you're not obligated at that point, but it's not a question at that point. It's not like, hey, you guys good? You want this study? It's no, here's your regulatory packet. How fast can you get up and going?
Yeah, somebody's going to get annoyed if you say no at that point, which you...
I mean, you definitely worry if it happens too many times. Maybe once here and there. And I would think that sponsors would appreciate that honesty, but how many times can you tell IQVIA no before they stop coming to you?
Yeah, I mean, when we say no to a protocol, we are just super specific. Like, these are all the reasons why we don't want to do this, and sometimes it needs to happen. I think usually it's received quite well, but I agree with you. Like, if it ends up being generalized at a high level of like they said no to 3 of our protocols, yeah, that's not really probably a position you want to be in. So is it always the enrollment that puts you off the most, and that makes you say no to a study? It's never like just too much complexity here, or we think there's going to be like high patient dropout. Like, do you think about that?
We do. Also, budget is obviously a consideration. But I do think, especially now, like complexity is becoming more important in our decision making as we have studies that are great studies, and we don't want to sacrifice the quality work we're doing on good protocols to chase our tails in complex protocols. So, I mean, recently I opened up a feasibility questionnaire. And the questions were so complex that I didn't even fill it out. I just go, no, we don't want to do it. I don't want to know anything else about this. This is such a complex feasibility that I don't even want to fill it out. It's going to take me hours and days to even get close to guessing the answers to these questions. So I think those are all considerations.
That's interesting. Okay. So what if you get beyond the feasibility piece, like what does too complex look like?
That's a good question. And that's where, like my recent post about like how are our sites scoring studies, I have a real fascination with right now, because I do think it's insanely subjective. And again, you can look at a schedule of assessments and sort of be fooled. And, you see in the comments here, like, someone saying like they didn't realize that there was a 2-hour mix time on an unblinded drug until at SIV. So you can even look at it and say, this looks great. And then something comes up that's incredibly complex later that it's too late. You inked the contract. Now you're on the hook. So I'll be really honest with you. I don't have a solid, like, objective answer for you. It really is kind of you're kind of feeling it out as you go, which I don't love. And I want to get away from doing that because, you can't run everything by like intuition alone.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, interesting that Craig Lipset said like that sponsors usually have an internal complexity score, which if there's anyone here in the audience that knows about that, I'd love to learn more about it, because it seems like it's not necessarily a bad idea, I guess, to publicize that. Maybe you'll end up paying a little bit more, but usually complex trials are going to be more expensive anyway. So it's probably helpful actually to achieve higher success rates, right?
I think even if we could recognize that going in, and sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes it's not. And so, if you threw me a protocol and it had a 10 out of 10 complexity score, well, that doesn't mean it's a no automatically, but at least I know what I'm getting into, when I decide to further venture into, taking that trial on. So I think, look, the more data we have, the better. It's kind of sad that that stuff doesn't get shipped down to sites to at least understand,
Yeah, exactly. Did you look at that Ontario protocol assessment level?
The Opal or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Opal. It's something I had heard about, and it's actually why I asked the question, because I couldn't remember what the acronym was.
Right.
I sent it over to someone else on my team, but I haven't had a chance to go very deep into it. So no, I'm familiar with the basic concept, but I haven't looked at it with enough depth to have any to speak about it intelligently, unfortunately.
Yeah, so we should probably take a look at that. And I'll try to break it down on the call. But that's probably an interesting starting point, right? And I think there was another comment by Russell talking about length of study, frequency of visits, number of imaging visits, route of IP, etc. I mean, they all make sense, but I guess no one's actually scoring them individually in that way.
Well, and to your point, man, is this not of all the things that I could think of AI to do, could I not dump a protocol in there?
I mean,
and it spit something out for me to say hey, here's what you should expect. And again, I mean, even if it's not perfect, that seems so low hanging fruit and the kind of things we could easily be doing.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, protocols are very text heavy, obviously. So this new generation of AI can 100% help with that. I mean, it would be fun proof of concepts. It wouldn't actually be very complex. Probably take a look at this. It's one thing to ingest and kind of break down what is in the protocol. It's another thing to then score it, which would be much harder for an AI, right? But if we can take that OPAL scoring, for example, and assume there's some kind of scientific rigor to how it was put together and apply it to protocol, we might have something pretty cool. I wonder, is there anyone in the audience that has a more sort of developed way of scoring protocols, or is this it basically? Because that's the feeling I'm getting. For most people, there's no science to it. It's just, and for a lot of people, it seems like it's just let's just get it done, type attitude.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that was the kind of overwhelming sentiment that I got, and even talking to sites like mine. I mean, I think that's unfortunately how it is. Or you've got 5 people around the table breaking it down sort of the best that they can, but again, you still don't even have enough information at that point to really make a truly informed decision. And look, it's okay. Sometimes we're going to pick wrong. It just happens. It's not the end of the world, but I sure like to avoid doing it, 6 times or 10 times if I can keep from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, if we try to reverse to an answer, what is it? How would you describe an unattractive trial for you if you go all the way to the end?
Describe a what trial?
An unattractive trial, like a protocol
So
that you don't want to do.
I think a it's going to sound like a pipe dream, but a clear and simple inclusion exclusion criteria that are at least representative enough of the patient population that you can enroll a decent chunk, a schedule of assessments that's not wrought with pages and pages of footnotes and if this then that type situations, which again, I understand this is not feasible in some instances, and especially in some indications. And also, it very clearly breaks down the requirements of each of those things within the schedule of assessments. I mean, it's still basic problems like vital signs. Okay. Well, I didn't realize till I did my first 2 patients that it was 5 sets of vital signs, 6 minutes apart, in different postural positions. It didn't say that, or maybe it did, but it was in a footnote. Again, I would like to see more specific workflow kind of built into these protocols. And I don't understand, in a world where we're so obsessed with standardization, why there's no freaking standardization in giving sites some guidelines in how to accomplish these things,
I mean, there are standards on like digital ways to define a protocol, but there's the adoption, right? I mean, adoption in our industry is just slow across the board. And so, even though Trendsetter may be doing a great job in terms of setting up a standard to capture what a protocol should contain in a digital way, so you can also process it in a digital way, doesn't mean that the average protocol that you see, I think that's another thing that's interesting, right? We actually see in the trenches, just that there's a huge delay between when the innovation starts to trickle down and then when it actually reaches, the sites. So I do think that it's coming, but it will take probably 5 to 10 years before you start to see that more than just a regular good old free text protocol. And so you actually answered my question in the other way around, right? So what does good look like? But I was thinking, like, ultimately you need to, you're running a business, so you need to make money. So not enrolling patients in a trial obviously is not a good trial. So that's why these inclusion criteria are important. Plus, you want those patients to have access to that trial. You don't want to exclude them. And then, of course, patient dropout, I think, is a huge one that also doesn't help you. And I guess, like, because I was thinking, right, a trial with a lot of site visits, yes, okay, so there's patient burden, so that could lead to more dropout. At the same time, more site visits is in a way good for a site, right? I mean, presumably you get compensated for that. Or is there a level where you're like, you know what, this is too much, even though I get paid for it? It's like I don't want this level of intensity.
Sure. No, there is a tipping point, but I think, and I've wanted to say this for a while now. The patient burden is obviously a big deal. People talk about it a lot, but I will say this: overwhelmingly, more than I ever expected, patients want to be in the study. They, even though like we were dealing with crappy ePros, or here also wear a Holter monitor for a weird secondary endpoint that nobody seems to care about, and you're not going to get paid extra for it, but please do more work for us. I'm shocked time and time again by the lengths that patients will go to be in these trials. And, not to make it sound like self-serving, but I think a fair amount, if not an overwhelming majority, don't mind and even like coming into clinic. They see their doctor. I mean, they know these research coordinators like their friends. I know their pets' names. You develop a relationship like with these patients, and you're there for them, throughout their healthcare journey. Now, not that can't be still captured in more, remote visits and home health and things like that. But, I while I'm sensitive about the patient burden, I feel like we have very few patients who are just like throw their hands up and are like, I don't want to do this. This is too many e-diaries. Now, that doesn't mean we should push it, anymore. Like, we should still simplify things as much as possible. But I feel like I'm, again, surprised time and time again by the lengths that patients will go to be in trials. So I don't know. Again, I see it brought up a lot. But I feel like we don't see a ton of dropout, at least not for burden issues, Maybe
Yeah,
they want to get
well,
a treatment.
there could be some kind of bias at play here, of course. But
Of course.
maybe the problem is, I feel like the science around dropout is pretty solid. It's probably quite easy to measure, I think, and quite easy to report on. But like, for example, for me, if I would participate in a trial, like high frequency of site visits would be very unattractive.
Sure.
So I think it's so the population that's
Well, and
Go
so
ahead.
sorry. Here's what you end up with. And this is, again, a conversation I had earlier today. You end up with two types of people in clinical trials. You end up with the very privileged who have time to give away and can take off work or otherwise not reliant on childcare and all these other things, or people who are so desperate that they absolutely have to be there because it's the only treatment option, quote unquote, that they have. So this is where it creates a really weird and gross feeling distinction sometimes, is because I feel like that's oftentimes the two types of patient you see fairly regularly, right? Because I'm the same way. I'm like, I mean, I wouldn't be in most clinical trials. I do this every day, and I'm shocked. I'm still shocked when people decide to be in a clinical trial, which sounds like a terrible thing to say, because it is sacrificing, a fair amount. But again, what I tend to see is the people who are either above like the problems that come with that burden, or the people who are so desperate they have no other choice than to try to be in a clinical trial.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say you're not sick, right? I mean, that definitely changes things. Like,
true.
If you're sick and you're struggling to find the right treatment, this becomes a whole different thing. Now suddenly this becomes the biggest thing in your life. So I would probably, like, if I, God forbid, knock on wood, would get cancer. I would obviously
say that these are.
I would come. I would come to the clinic as many times as needed. So I think it's hard to imagine that level of motivation, I think, until you're in it. But it would still be easier for me, of course, if some of these things can happen remotely, if that's possible, which of course for a lot of things they aren't. But I mean, the general point is interesting, right? Like, patients are motivated to participate in trials. I think that's true. It's probably also the type of study, what's at stake, right? If you are conducting a lot of trials where there's a lot at stake, probably much more motivated to stay in it, even though it's burdensome.
You see it if it's acute or if it's chronic pain. Yeah, people are they want to be in that trial because they're dealing with hell every day. If it's mild atopic dermatitis, well, maybe it's not quite, the stakes aren't quite so high, right? And there's some pretty good treatments on the market, so it's pretty hard to convince patients to take up a bunch of extra time to be less itchy. So I think it definitely depends on the therapeutic area and how affected they are by it. So yeah, there's a lot of spectrum here.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and this is the whole reason why this is such a difficult question to ultimately give a definitive answer to. And then there's also the question is being brought up here about diversity. In the end, there is no one good solution to these things, right? Because one protocol might be great to conduct in New York, totally stuck in Oklahoma, and the other way around. Clearly, like, there's the simple thing that there's just a much higher tolerance for driving longer distances. Like, I come from the Netherlands originally. We bike everything. For me, before I came here, 2-hour drive is like 2 hours. I would never drive 2 hours. And like, just being exposed to the normality of just casually driving 4 to 6 hours, and me doing it myself, of course, as well, more now, because more places to drive to. Not that I have a car in New York, but I rent one. Like, it just shifts your perspective. I now feel like 2 hours, come on. But like, right. 2 hours, you're in Germany, right? In the Netherlands, you're in a different country in the Netherlands. So it's interesting, like, how even just where you are changes what was perceived hard or not hard, or
and we see that too across, like, some studies enroll awesome in our more rural clinics, and some do better in our more urban, as urban as you can be in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. But nonetheless, even then, you see a little bit of a dichotomy between how studies might enroll based on where you are. So yeah, I mean, that's a valid point entirely.
So I think the good news is there are some actionable things that everyone designing a protocol could ultimately do, right? I think so. The exclusion is a much more complicated topic. We need to get into the science and the regulatory pathways, and there's a ton of things. But I think general gist is, like, let's at least validate carefully that this is an enrollable trial, because nobody wins if this is not an enrollable trial. But then I think on the site support side, and like just breaking down the schedule of events into more of a playbook and sort of the knowledge sharing, those are really, like, super actionable, feasible suggestions, right?
Yeah, and I saw somebody up in the comments, I think, asked a question about providing procedural guidelines to sites. I mean, overwhelmingly, no, they don't. But I have had studies that have actually given us it's almost like an SOP, like, for how to run each visit, which is unfortunately rare. But when we had it, it was freaking amazing. You can pop that thing open and you know exactly what to expect. And again, I don't know how hard or costly that is for sponsors to do, but man, I gotta feel like the ROI on that's through the roof. I have to think so. So I'd love to see that, more of that.
I mean, I think if you think about, like, all these one-off, almost everything that's by definition one-off in a trial is cheap. Like it's because where the true cost comes into cost per patient. I mean, like, and that's just where everything starts to scale and becomes incredibly expensive, right? But as long as you can centralize things, almost always, I think, if it has even a 10% increase in in the quality of the study or an enrollment rate, or it's going to be worth it, because you make that investment once and you can give it to all the sites and to all the patients. Which is also why I'm a strong advocate for like true e-consent, right? Like I keep pushing that agenda, because you make that investment once to like break it down, to make it educational, to like give them this onboarding wizard. It's not just e-consent, it becomes e-enrollment or e-onboarding, like whatever we call that. How you would be onboarding to a fancy tool. You make that investment once, but all patients are now better informed, and have better comprehension of the trial, know what they're getting into. And so I think that's often overlooked, that you can make a one-off investment that can actually impact all the sites or all the participants in a trial in a positive way. But hopefully we'll see more of that if we keep doing these types of events. Like you said, just talk about it, right?
And there are companies out there, I think, working towards different, ways to address these issues. So I think it as hard to believe as it may be, I'm actually like super optimistic. So don't laugh out there if you hear me say that. But as much as I complain and sort of act grumpy, like I'm really optimistic, because I think these conversations are happening. People are listening, people are learning, and people are developing things to help address them. So I mean, that's it. I mean, I think we're moving in the right direction. It's just nothing moves quickly, man. I just got to get used to the slow grind that is clinical trials.
Tell me about it. 12 years ago, I thought I would like completely upend evidence-based medicine in 5 years. Well, definitely not happened yet.
It's good to be ambitious, though, man. You got to keep fighting.
Exactly. And real-world evidence is a big one. It's going to be more. You should do more real-world evidence trials. It's interesting.
I never even heard. I mean, I'll be honest. I didn't know what it meant for the longest time. Like I felt like an idiot. I'm like, real-world evidence, just
it's
evidence
a crazy
that already
broad
exists.
Category. But it's like very often happen in academia, of course, right? I mean that's where I come from, and it's of course super interesting to compare a new drug against a standard of care or against another drug. But you can imagine that for the pharmaceutical companies, it's a little bit harder to directly conduct that trial, because you're working with the competitor's product. So it's often academia ultimately that is running those, and that's probably why you see also less of them, because you're not academia, right? So you typically would see.
Fair.
But I think some of those sort of more open label studies, I think they're lower complexity. So in that sense, they should be somewhat easier to conduct, and super important data that comes out of those.
But I mean, there's. No, go ahead. I'll say, are they essentially like? Did they have a lower, like, scientific power, because they're almost essentially retrospective, right? I mean, and they're certainly not.
No. There's a ton of phase 4 trials that are prospective. Like where you actually run a trial. You haven't even randomized. You have randomized phase 4 trials. The key thing to describe them is the fact that they happen post-market approval, right? So they happen with an approved drug.
And I guess
you're right.
We've seen very few. We've seen very little randomized phase 4. It's usually if they're already being prescribed, like by coincidence, then they'll be in versus some sort of control group. So I mean, again, it is what it is. I wasn't sure if that's like it's like doing meta-analyses is not as high of a scientific power as a true randomized trial. But maybe that doesn't matter. I don't know.
I don't know. This becomes let's not start that conversation at the end of this one. But happy to talk more about that. But I think ultimately in terms of levels of evidence, the systematic review, which would include all these types of trials, including the original RCTs and the phase 4s, and then the trials that the academics conduct, sometimes with their own money, sometimes with sponsor money. The investigator-initiated trials with sponsor funding. All of them would roll into, if they're well conducted and they pass the methodology quality test, be part of a systematic review, and that's always considered the highest level of evidence. Which is why that initial trial you're conducting is only a small piece of the puzzle. That's just to allow this thing on the market, and then the real work begins to get it into the pen. The only thing that's different in the US versus Europe is US you market directly to the physicians. You have these people going there and basically selling the drug to the prescribers, to the healthcare professionals. In Europe and the Netherlands, that's like much more damped down. So it's much more, I think, based on the guidelines being changed, based on the new drug being available. But we can talk a lot more about that. I think, is there any more questions from the audience or call outs that they want to make? Just opinions they want from Brad, because this is the time to do it. We're almost at the hour.
Yeah, if you guys got any other last minute, please tell me I'm an idiot or, whatever. I mean, I do think seems to be a lot of interest in the concept of sort of protocol scoring. And I think, is it Kylie gives like a fair point in that, it's going to be still incredibly subjective from site to site. But even then, at least you still got a starting point, right? Like, I mean, yeah, a DEXA may be easy for you to get to, it may be difficult for me to get to, but if I know, at least if I know that up front, I can accommodate it or decide not to. So yeah, it may change the level of complexity, but it at least sets the stage for knowing what I'm in for, which sometimes again is not always the case. Or it may say MRI, but I didn't know that I needed a specific MRI with specific settings that I don't have access to, or I thought I did, but now I don't. Yeah, I don't know. And then, Nisha, your question about patients being involved in protocol design, I think there are some groups out there like addressing that. I'm actually really interested in that myself, but
it's definitely happening. I would actually be surprised if a new protocol gets designed these days without somehow involving patient communities. I mean, it's such there's been so much attention for it. It's also such a no-brainer, I think. I mean, I hope. I'm not sure, but I do think, I know for a fact that a lot of the sponsors are doing that. I'm not entirely sure how widespread it is yet, but I hope pretty widespread. How do you as a patient get to be in that position? I don't have the definitive answer, but I definitely think like joining a patient advocacy group, that would put you probably on the list to that's probably where the sponsors go to find these people. And then I think there's also specific organizations that do just that, right? So these organizations exist to work with sponsors to make trials better. So you can seek them out and probably sign up as a, I don't know, volunteer or maybe even
there's a awesome community on LinkedIn when it comes to clinical research. So, I mean, if you do some searching, I bet you can find some patient advocates and probably get some good answers there.
Yeah, I agree. Okay. Should we wrap up?
Sure.
All right. Well, it was awesome. I wrote down a couple of thoughts for future conversations. There's always so much more, but happy that we can do more work on the scoring piece, but at least there's some actionable things that seem very feasible to make trials.
Wasn't just a bitch fest. I mean, I tried to put some ideas out there. Weird, huh?
Well, I enjoyed it very much. Thank you, Brad, and thanks everyone in the audience. A lot of questions and comments. See you again soon.
Thanks, guys.